thank you so much, Black Women Animate, for putting together this bootcamp and for inviting me to do this director workshop. My name is Latoya Raveneau. I am a director / writer over at DisneyTVA. Currently, I'm directing on the new upcoming Proud Family, Louder and Prouder. And I'm super excited to share with you some of my methodology on directing. This is super subjective. Directing is one of those positions where it's managerial, and so it's very much each director has their own way of doing things. But for people hoping to go into directing, I would love to just show kind of my thought process and my general process, just so you can see what a director pipeline is like. So let me share my screen. Okay. So I built this thing out for Instagram a few months ago when the quarantine first started, and it's been very handy because I had a lot of friends who were board artists who wanted to jump into directing, and they were like, "What does a director do?" So this document is available online at www.toyarave.com if you're interested in owning it or seeing other day-to-days of different roles. So basics, in animation, in TV animation, a director is almost always from storyboards. It's not 100% true, but almost always, because in TV animation, the director is working closest with the storyboard team. And they are really the ones who are creating this unified, cohesive narrative and kind of directing the cinematography and the shot choices. And so them having a knowledge of the storyboarding process, and B, of a handle on cinematography and a handle of how to set up shots in the most effective way is super important. And that said, though, I do know actually one of the other directors on Proud Family came from design, for example, so it's not unheard of, but a knowledge of story is always kind of essential. So again, my qualifier that everybody has their own styles. When I was a board artist, I had directors who were super hands-off. They basically handed me a script and was like, go with God. And then I've had directors who were extremely hands-on, and they'd thumbnail the entire script and then give me all their thumbnails. At the end of the day, it's whatever works best for you as a director, what works best for your team, and what works best for the show that you're working on. And ultimately, the only real goal of the director, I guess it's twofold. One, it is to make sure that your team of artists is happy and satisfied and like doing their best work possible. And then overarchingly, as a director, it is to make a strong and unified story. So let's begin at the beginning, which for directors is the script. So all of Proud is still under NDA, so we won't be talking about that today. I pulled a script from a show I worked on a year ago called Final Space. This is from season 2. And this is what a sample of just a snippet of the script usually looks like when we get it. First and foremost, I would probably have a conversation with the art director and with the supervising director to just talk about the logistics of the things in the script as far as like design. So like, for example, this scene says like interior, Crimson Light, Fox and Locato's room. So we would have a conversation where it's like, okay, so do we have the design for the room? How much of this room do we need to be showing? All these pre-planning things so that we're not creating a bunch of work for something that is ultimately quite small, because TV animation, one of the many things that you have to work around is the budgets are usually considerably smaller than feature. So there's not a lot of resources to just create new backgrounds for every single moment. So you really have to like pick those moments that matter. And then, so looking for opportunities to economize, the next step that you would probably do is sequence the script. So most of the time, board artists right now are working in a program called Storyboard Pro, and they are usually not doing the entire board within one file, just for manageability, and also because if they're only working in one file, then that means you're only getting everything at the very end. So usually what we do is we'll break up the script into sequences, usually broken up by changes in the background or changes in like, oh, this is the end of Act 1, this is the beginning of Act 2, just to section it out so that, one, you can make it more manageable as it goes through the artist and comes back, and two, when you have a team of artists, so that everybody's getting kind of like a bit of work instead of like massive chunks of boards. The schedules for storyboarding are usually fairly small, usually anywhere from 4 weeks to 6 weeks. So there's not a lot of time to board these like 22-minute episodes. So yeah, so this is sequence 5 of this script from Final Space. And in this scene, it's about these two characters. It's a difficult scene in that there isn't actually a lot going on. It is two characters having an argument. And I wanted to show this scene, one, because it's one of the first scenes I'd ever fully directed solo, and two, because this is one of those scenes that did require a lot of direction because of how simple it is. I can't remember which director. I don't think it was Hitchcock, but it was a Hitchcock type who was like, conversation scenes are harder to direct than like a fight sequence. So what I usually do next is I will take the script and then I will thumbnail everything out or put all my notes onto the script so that when I hand it out to the board artist, they can see kind of what my thought process is. And my goal is always to kind of solve problems that will be like massive question marks for the board artist. So I try not to be particularly heavy-handed with my board team. I just want to give them enough guidance that they're not staring at the script like I have no idea where anything is or what I'm supposed to be doing. So for this, when I read this, so Fox confronts Little Kato, this is a rather vague sentence. So I thought, and this connects to the previous shot, but because the previous shot ended on the Little Kato character, that we should start with him because we were kind of following him. So I would pen in like, start with Little Kato and then have Fox's shadow rise up over him. So I liked this idea that we start with the character we were kind of tracking last and then have this other character kind of step into his space. Another feature of this particular story is these two characters had a crazy height difference. And so this is just something I would pen in to remind my board artists where it's like, the Little Kato character is super tiny, and then this Fox character is massive. So I always wanted their size relationship to be like tiny, big, and like trying to find ways to stage it so that the tiny character was kind of getting up in the big character's face, even despite their height differences. It's like he's trying to match him toe to toe. And then another thing that I penned in, and you'll notice I didn't really write down where they should be going, but I said, keep them moving around the room. Because again, this is a conversational scene. There's a real risk of it being like, they're standing perfectly still and just saying blocks of text at each other. So I wanted to make sure that the board artists, from the second that they saw the script, they were already thinking of like, okay, they're like running from one end of the room as he says his line, and like then comes back, and just kind of keep energy throughout it so it doesn't become static. And because it's an argument and not like if this was like a heartfelt conversation scene where I felt like we really needed to sit in like an emotion, then I would probably do the exact opposite and be like, don't cut very much, just really let us take in this emotion. But because this is like a high energy argument, and when I play a clip in a second, you will truly appreciate the level of intensity of this argument. I wanted to keep kind of just like this go, 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 go energy, even in the staging. And then this is something that is not always the case. Like, again, this is super subjective, but I like involving, especially on a show like Final Space, where it was a big ensemble show. There are all these characters on the ship at all times. And so I thought it would be very funny if at some point in this argument, we see someone else like just walk by, and on the show, they have this little like circular floating character. And I was like, okay, so what if at the end of this argument, they're like still screaming at each other, we just cut outside of the room and just see the little floaty guy like just going about his business. Because I feel like, especially on a show like this, which is a lot of comedy, any opportunity to add like more visual gags, it's like, just make it funny. Just add more gags. That is definitely a case-by-case situation. Sometimes it might not call for a shot that wasn't specified in the script, but for something like this, I felt that shot could really plus this moment. So this is pretty much what it looks like when I hand out a script to a board artist. And so this is the step 3 of a board launch, where I would go over basically a script's worth, like a 22 to 30 pages worth of things that look like this. And that would be the opportunity to kind of talk to the board artist and see, do they have any questions? Is there anything that they're like, oh, actually, when I was reading the script, I have an idea. animation is super collaborative. So I try to like ask if they have anything that they wanted to try out, and we can discuss it. They could try it, and maybe we'll see if it works. I also use a lot of like reference videos, images, basically anything to help the board artist understand what you're looking for. And just the goal of these board launches is to get everybody seeing the same episode. Even if they're seeing different shots, even if they have different ideas, it's like we're all seeing the same episode. Another thing I like to prepare more recently than I even did on Final Space is top downs. So for some shows, this isn't necessary. And again, super subjective. But a lot of times I find, especially if there's a location that has never existed before, rather than having design start and build the space, to basically build the space in this really janky architectural drawing where I'm just like, a bed, a window, a door, like just so that everybody knows where all of the architecture is in the room, so that when design, so this in theory would exist before there's any like final artwork. On some shows, ironically also on Final Space, this wasn't necessary for that because they'd already built this room. So it's kind of a whichever exists first wins. So if the room already existed, then it's like, okay, so this is the room. If the room didn't exist before, then it's kind of like you as the director are deciding where do you need architectural features to be so that you can tell the story the way it needs to be told and like really set up the shots that you need. So I'm going to stop screen share for a hot minute so I can kind of recalibrate some things and pull up a video for you guys to see. Let me share this again, and with computer sound this time. Okay. Cool. So this video is chicken scratch, and I feel no shame in sharing this because I did a better percentage of these thumbnails. This is a thumbnail pass, like basically the chicken scratch version of the scene that we were just talking about, where you have this character who shows up to his room, and then this other character kind of gets up in his face like, what are you doing? These are my zones. And they have this whole big argument back and forth. So let me just play so you can see what a first pass of this looks like. Okay.
Ben Tracy, do you think I don't know you've been dipping your paw in my mouth in the middle of the night?
Get out of here, you're crazy.
Oh, the hair in my mouth isn't crazy? Now is it? You know what? I need you to vacate my zones right now.
I don't see any zones.
Open your eyes. They start here and end there. Right there. Right where you're standing. Ooh, you're on the tip of my zones. It's making me furious.
Oh, well, it just so happens that your zones are in my zones.
You're insane! I had established zones. Here, and right there. You will not disrespect my zones. My zones are independent, strong-willed, and beautiful.
Okay, so it kind of, because a lot of this was still in flux, it was extremely, like towards the end, I think we ended up cutting that audio. But you can kind of see, this is not a rough pass. This is just the first, like getting ideas down, kind of gauging how these characters might move into the space. So this wouldn't even be something that the board artists would pitch. This would be kind of something they would show me and then we would discuss. So what we ended up discussing after we talked about this was, I loved this idea of having this little character kind of go up in some way so that he could get on a closer to eye level with this much bigger character. However, there's a moment where he says like, you're standing on the edge of my zones, but he's not standing on anything. So I suggested to the board artist that we restage this so that he's maybe on the ladder. So just so the logic jump of like, wait a minute, he's not standing on anything. Just so that there's like a surface that he's like, okay, he's standing on something. And then we did some suggestions of like, oh, okay, maybe we can use the ladder as a framing device. So when we get a shot like this, then we would see it from behind the ladder. So this is a good point to talk to a board artist when it's still rough, because it's super, changes are easier to do when you haven't invested a lot of time in drawing it. So I really encourage my board artists to show me their things whilst it's still like fast and loose. And that way we can really because sometimes it's hard to see what needs to happen until there's like a mark on the page. It's kind of like when you're writing something, it's just the blank document is so daunting that just getting any mark on the page gives you something to bounce off of. So this was the bounce off of stage. So let me stop this and just go back. In fact, I think I'll just share everything so that you guys can see it all at once. Okay, so back to our little guide. So usually, so this would happen during this guidance and assistance phase. So like during the rough pass, directors check in on thumbnails. So they would show me things like that. And we just keep talking about composition and changing things. I think this was the stage at which I was like, we're cutting the dialogue. So it ends at that moment where the little guy flies by. And then our next stage in most TV pipelines, not all of them, some of them don't have a rough pitch. Some of them just turn in rough animatics and then it's cut together and edited. So it really depends on the show. But on shows like Proud Family and on a lot of the Disney shows and other productions I've worked on, you have this stage where the board artist is essentially pitching their idea to you as the director and also to the supervising director, who is the person who's kind of overseeing the entire story team and is the one like guiding the vision of the director. So if the directors are guiding the vision of each of the board artists, the supervising director is guiding the vision of each of the directors. And like, it's just everybody making sure we're making the same show. During this rough pitch, Final Space is a little bit different because we did have animatic, like we had audio and playable files. Other shows don't have this. Usually it's the board artist kind of talking through all of their shots and being like, and then this character steps here, and then he says, and da, 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 da. And so they're basically, you're literally pitching each of these scenes to the supervising director so they can see how each shot would play together. And this would be for the entire episode. So if it's a team of multiple board artists, it would be like one board artist onto the next, onto the next, onto the next, until the entire episode has been pitched. So let me pull up my rough. So this is the rough version of that same scene. And you will see quite a bit has changed in this stage based on the discussion that was had with the board artists after their thumbnails. So let me just play this little 55-second thing for you guys.
Ben Tracy, do you think I don't know you've been dipping your paw in my mouth in the middle of the night?
Get out of here, you're crazy.
Oh, the hair in my mouth isn't crazy? Now is it? You know what? I need you to vacate my zones right now.
I don't see any zones.
Open your eyes. They start here and in there. Right there. Right where you're standing. Ooh, you're on the tip of my zones. It's making me furious.
Oh, well, it just so happens that your zones are in my zones.
You're insane! I had established zones. Here, and right there. You will not disrespect my zones. My zones.
Oh, so we didn't cut the audio yet. Yes, I'm remembering all of these things. So you will see in this final stage of this, at some point, this little tail bit, which it's funny seeing this again after it's been a while. I'm like, why is this still here? And it's forcing me to relive at what point that decision was made. So another thing in the TV animation pipeline is a lot of things are still in flux. Like story things can still be in flux. So one of the major roles of the director is kind of moving with the fluctuations that happen to story based on notes that the supervising director says, based on notes that the showrunner says. So at some point in the lifespan of that scene, someone, either me or the showrunner, saw that and was like, we have to cut it. But I'm learning it happened later than I realized. So the board artists would show the rough pitch, and I'm sure you guys noticed from that there were quite a few things that had changed. A lot of the acting is kind of finessed, and a lot of these poses don't get much, like if they work, this level of clean is pretty much okay for me. We added this rack focus shot from a hairball to this character, just so we could keep pushing this composition and like making these shots where we feel like, oh, they're like really close to each other, and like really, if this scene's goal is infringing on personal space, I really wanted to make shots that made you feel like, oh, they are in each other's personal space. So that's the other thing that I try to keep in mind when I direct is, what is the goal of this shot? Like, what is the the tone and the, like, if you had to pick an adjective to describe the scene, what would it be? And so for this one, I think it was like uncomfortable, no personal space. So a lot of these shots where it's like the big guy really taking up all of the screen and the little guy just kind of like standing in the corner screaming up at him. Yeah, let me go to the next bit of this. So the rough pitch happens, the supervising director will give their notes, the director will give their notes, and then the board artist gets to clean up all of their boards. As I said, like some board artists do roughs that are almost clean. So at that point, I'll just be like, fix this pose, throw some mats behind things. Different directors and different shows have different definitions of what clean means. So Final Space is a little bit loose actually for clean. I've worked on shows where the cleanup phase is very tight. But yeah, so usually, or at least on the shows I've worked on, usually there's no clean pitch. It'll be like the board artists clean up everything, and then they turn in those boards to the director. And at that point, the director usually does their own pass. So I'll go over the boards and do any little like, oh, I want to adjust the timing, or oh, I want to plus this pose or change this pose. And then once the director does their pass, it's off to edit. And so it'll just be sent to edit. I described the director is the function box. So basically, you are, as a director, you are forcing all of these different sequences to become similar, at least in the sensibility, so that it all, when it cuts together, it feels like one unified episode. And so yeah, animatic. So at this stage, the board artists have moved on to their next episode. So simultaneous to you giving these notes, directors are also preparing future episodes. And I think this is where the jump from boarding to directing gets particularly challenging, is because when you're a board artist, you have your script, you do your board, you turn in your board, you move on to your next script. When you're a director, you have one episode that's with the board artist, one episode that's with animatic, one episode that's about to ship, one episode that's coming back from animation. So you are like just keeping all the balls in the air. And I genuinely love the multitasking, but I think that is the jump from being this extremely like solo, or at least, you know, focused to my one job position, to being suddenly someone who has to do like 3 different tasks all at once at any given time, is a bit of an adjustment. It's extremely doable. So even if you've never been like a revisionist before, like I think revisions prepare you to be a director because there's some multitasking, but even if you go straight from boards to directing, it's completely doable. It'll take you a second, and then you'll be like, oh, okay. So now you'll get good at putting sticky note lists together, and I have a to-do list. So you get organized real fast once you jump into directing. Speaking of revisions, so this is the stage at which there is basically another pass at the boards after the animatic, after we see the episode all cut together. Usually there's another board artist. Sometimes, I think on Final Space, actually, we didn't have revisionists. So sometimes it's the board artists that were boarding it. We'll do a pass on the changes. So after you see the whole episode cut together and kind of timed, there'll be things that become more obvious of like, oh, this doesn't really cut together well, or, oh, we should add another shot of this. So the revisionist, if they are their own position, usually ends up working really close with the director because they are making changes very fast, usually on multiple episodes. So it'll be like, oh, we have to do these changes to episode number 5, but also we are doing changes on like episode number 1. Let me see what's on to the next. Okay, so after all of the revisions are done, at most studios, including Disney, and Final Space was at Shadow Machine, there is an executive pass. So you send the animatic off to the studio executives who are, you know, manning this series. So at Disney, there are Disney executives. At Shadow Machine for Final Space, there was TBS was our kind of mothership studio. So we'd send off to TBS for notes. And so same process as with the animatic for the supervising director. They see the animatic and then they send back usually a Word document of just things that stood out to them, things that they really liked, things that they kind of didn't understand. And like, based on their notes, more revisions are done. So this process, usually it happens like 2 times where like the animatic goes out to executives, notes come back, we address the notes, the animatic goes back out to executives. They may have notes, but usually it's like, okay, on to the next. But just because of the limitations of the pipeline, where it's like, okay, we got to get this out at some point. Sometimes executives might ask to see the animatic another time. It really depends on the show. But because animation is so collaborative, it is really just making sure that this story is playing for all of the different people who need to sign off on it. So my qualifier for we're doing all the things. So directors usually work on 3 to 4 different episodes simultaneously. After a while, you get pretty accustomed to gauging the priority. I still definitely rely on my coordinators and like production people to keep me abreast of where everything needs to be by when. It's just checking in with people constantly to make sure that you know what thing is due first and you are prepared to have that thing whenever it's due. So multitasking. And then I had a mentor who told me something very early on when I was an assistant director, when I was like agonizing about the imposter syndrome of being an assistant director. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. And he's like, being a director doesn't mean you have to have the perfect decision. It just means you have to have a decision. So a lot of times I feel like, especially with new directors, it's getting comfortable with the fact that sometimes you'll make a call that wasn't necessarily the right call. It's the call that was made. And if it wasn't the right call, like if it works, awesome. If it doesn't work, that's fine. You'll deal with it. And you, mostly because of the time constraints, get very comfortable with the, okay, I just have to make a decision, because there's like 40 different ways to handle almost any situation. And there's no luxury of time to be able to be like, but is it the perfect shot? And sometimes there'll even be situations where I'm like, okay, I know the shot isn't quite right, but like it's serviceable for now. And in my brain, I'm like, well, we're going to change it in the next pass. So you start like in the same vein of multitasking and prioritizing. You like prioritize your own notes. So you're like, okay, I will do something to this later, but it's not a big enough issue that I need to like force people to do crazy hours or anything to get this done. Like it would be more beneficial to wait and then tackle this the next pass or something. So story above all, this kind of harkens back to the director's function box, where the goal of the director is to understand the needs of the show and the needs of this particular script, if it's a script-driven show, and constantly be asking yourself, like, what would this character do? Or how can I make what this character is doing, like on the page, something that's super specific to this character? So for example, if we look back at this script where, let me see, dipping your paw into my mouth in the middle of the night. This character Fox, who is voiced by Ron Funches and is just has a delightfully high-pitched voice for his size. It feels like he's the sort of character who is like, and like always like kind of fiddling with his hands and like gesticulating, and like he's a very animated character. So when I read his lines, in my mind, I would be thinking like, okay, how can we make him act this moment in the most Fox-esque way and like really lean into this, like, oh, he'd be like gesturing at Little Kato as he's saying this line, or like screaming down at him, or like waggling his finger at him. So just making it so that the behavior of the characters feel really consistent throughout the episodes and also throughout the entire show. And so story above all else. And then the question of where a director kind of begins and ends is, this question came up when I was presenting this before, and it's a little bit hard to tell because it's a little bit different for every show. But in my mind, I think consulting with the different heads of the different departments. So for example, the art director and the supervising director, and just making sure that everybody understands what the story needs. Because ultimately the director's realm of like real say is story. And so because story is the thing that everything else is servicing, you're not trying to like tell the art director what to do. Like obviously they have the most prowess at that skill, and you're just there to be like, oh, that's beautiful colors. But to make sure things like, for example, if you need a door to be in a certain spot for a shot and that design doesn't exist, letting them know that like, oh, I would like, if we can, the door to be in this spot. So it's very communicative. I try to make sure that everybody knows what I'm thinking as I'm going forward. And if I change my mind, I try to poke all the people that it would affect and kind of get clearance early, because it's easier to do things preemptively than after the fact. So I tend to over prepare and like over reach out and be like, is this okay? Is this gonna be okay? Will this create too many designs? And is this a character? Can we use, just to make sure that nobody is at the 11th hour like, we're doing what? Like, just so everybody knows what we're doing. So yeah, for example, the director might ask the art director for specific character modifications. So like, say for example, if there's an incidental and they're like, I really want to use this incidental, but I don't think this incidental should have glasses because of XYZ reason. Can I take the glasses off this incidental? And then the art director would be like, do that. So like, just making sure that everybody knows what we're doing so that there's not suddenly a ton of work at the end. So another question I got when I was presenting this before is, I want to be a director, where should I start? And this one is a supremely tricky question because there is no one path. Generally, storyboarding, at least right now, has been the most consistent way into directing for TV animation. But even that jump from storyboarding to directing is a bit jarring because it doesn't teach you about managing a team or delegating. But I would say definitely learning the skills of cinematography and kind of setting up shot choices and storyboarding is, fundamental. And then as far as the management stuff, just getting really organized. I found like when I first started as an assistant director, it kind of changed the way I work in my own like life. And I started being like, folders within folders and everything has like a label, like just getting extremely organized, because it was harder to turn organization off and on again, like organized at work, disorganized in life, than to just be like, we're organized now. And like that way it was like a fundamental personality shift in the way that I work, and it didn't feel like I was continually like taking off and taking on a hat. So that organization, definitely a go-to. Another thing I highly recommend is watching all the movies. Like watching all the movies and all the TV shows, even if you want to go into animation specifically and you're like, live action. Like I also am like animation forever, but there is sophistication to a lot of those old school filmmakers. I have a list: the Hitchcock, Kurosawa, Spielberg, Del Toro, Scorsese, Coppola. This list goes on and on. But basically, watch them, not just in the way of ingesting the movie, but watch it in the way of being like, why is the camera here? And what is the psychological effect of putting this camera here? These guys do it like nobody else, where you'll see a character in a doorway, and then ever so slightly the camera will start listing, and you're like, why is the camera listing? And then suddenly something will come off from the opposite frame, and you're like, oh God, I'm terrified, because that slight drift was pulling your attention away and kind of setting up a false expectation. So if you start watching these movies with an attention to what are they doing with the camera and why, you'll start building your own sensibilities, and you'll start noticing their sensibilities. Like Brad Bird has his famous camera move where he'll be like, something over here, something over here, something over here. So like a 3-part reveal that he does in almost all his movies. And if you don't believe me, just Google Brad Bird camera movie breakdown. YouTubers have done this. And then Spike Lee has his own kind of Spike Lee-isms. Miyazaki has his own kind of like Miyazaki-isms. And you start kind of recognizing the things that make those directors, like their voice and kind of what they really like to do. And as you build up your own inner mind library of like, oh, these are shots that I could use, after a while, you start realizing things you like to do. And you're like, oh, I really like reveals and having something in front of this and then having a character move on the Z-axis. Like you'll start noticing your own kind of like your directorial sense pretty much. And then, so this was just to discuss, because this was a breakdown of the role, who do directors work with? Kind of everyone, but primarily they're board artists and they're revisionists, because they're on the team. They're in the trenches with you. You are drawing and boarding this episode together. So you tend to work closest with them. And for me, something that's very important is making sure my board artists feel like there's a community on the show that we're on, and that like they can come to me, even if it's kind of unwork related. Like I want them to feel like they're not just cogs in a machine, because I mean, we're all kind of artists when you work on animation. So I want them to feel like this is not just a job. This is kind of like this space where they can be with people they like and working on things that they love. And then directors also tend to work really closely with production coordinators. They kind of keep us honest. I feel like I would not know what needs to be done if it weren't for the coordinators being like, okay, so here are all the things that need to be done. They make sure coordinators are kind of like moving things from A to B. They're the connective tissue of all of the shows usually. So we'll work very closely with them. And then we work very closely with the supervising director, who is essentially, the supervising director is the director's director. So they're making sure that we are giving the correct direction to our teams. And so usually when I first start a show, I try to really, if I can, if they can spare it, have a sit down with my supervising director and really try to see the show the way they see the show, so that I'm making calls that honor their sensibilities. And it's interesting. I feel like when you're a director, you're navigating kind of your own sensibilities and then the needs of the show, and finding the way to use your sensibilities effectively so that even the things you want to do are servicing the show. It's not like you're just like, I want to do it, so we're doing it. It's like, if there's something you want to do, but it doesn't make sense for this particular show, you might not be able to do it that way. And like, you just get very comfortable being like, another show, another day, another episode. There will be a time for whatever the shot is. And then directors kind of affect everyone again because of the interlocking positions, but definitely affect their team. As I said before, the different levels of communication a director will have can completely change the dynamic of the board team. If a director is very hands-on, it'll change the workload of the board team. So it's very much, the director is affecting a lot of the artists who are boarding these shows. Oh yes, different direction for every artist. So this is something that was truly invaluable, and I'm glad that I was able to talk to, when I was starting out, a more seasoned director about this, because I was noticing, it was funny, we were sitting in a bullpen, and I was noticing whenever an artist would come up to talk to him, it's like he'd kind of become a different person for each person. And that's sort of something you need to do. Like, as a director, your goal is to make the best version of the show and to make each artist deliver their best version of their shots. And so certain artists require continual checking in, and they really enjoy having those conversations. And so you would potentially need to, be really available for them and like make sure that they have you to bounce their ideas against. Other artists might be more introverted and kind of be like, okay, just like find me when it's due. And you change the way you work so that every artist feels comfortable and is able to do their best work. That doesn't mean that if an artist is like, oh, I don't like check-ins, that you just ignore them. It means that you maybe, instead of, having check-ins just whenever, that you're like, okay, so let's schedule a check-in for this point. Because it's finding the balance, right? Where it's like you want to allow each person to work in the way that is most native to them and feels best for them, but you also want to make sure you're still providing guidance and you're not just abandoning an artist and then they come up for air and you're like, oh God, but like you want to make sure that you're seeing where they're going and kind of they know and they're all going on the same and the correct path. Tools of the trade, this is one I got into just because I was presenting this to people who are very green. Usually Storyboard Pro, sometimes for things like this top-down view, Photoshop. Premiere, not so much anymore, but there's definitely been instances where as a director, I've had to do rough cuts. So sometimes directors end up using editing software, but that's not normal, so that's not essential. And then the calendar. I put this on there not as a joke, but kind of as a joke, but it is the single most important application on my computer is the calendar, because it tells you exactly when everything is going on. And I feel like once I started really getting into directing, I started putting everything, like even if I was like, oh, are you free to check in like an hour? Like I put that on the calendar just to make sure that nothing gets overlooked. And then I use this metaphor exhaustively. I'm so sorry for anyone who's heard it before. But so directors are kind of the conductors who are just helping to guide everybody's hand. And then the storyboard artists are the musicians who are like, I am exceptional at the violin and I'm killing it on the horns. And your goal as the director conductor is just to make sure that all of these like incredible musicians are making a song that is cohesive at the end. So I feel like a lot of times I can't hype up the board artists enough. Like they are the backbone of this. And your job of the director is just to allow and shape and kind of like guide them in a way that allows them to use their skills most effectively and in a way that is really enjoyable for them. So before I close this out, because I know this was the end of this particular slide, I'm going to show you guys the kind of final form of this particular scene. So above top is this is the clean animation that we sent over to the overseas studio, and then below is the final animation that went to air.
Then Tracy, do you think I don't know you've been dipping your paw in my mouth in the middle of the night?
Get out of here, you're crazy.
Oh, the hair in my mouth isn't crazy. Now is it? You know what? I need you to vacate my zones right now.
I don't see any zones.
Open your eyes. They start here and in there. Right there. Right where you're standing. Ooh, you're on the tip of my zones. It's making me furious.
Oh, well, it just so happens that your zones are in my zones.
You're insane! I had established zones. Here, and right there. You will not disrespect my zones.
Yeah, so as you can see, a lot of the things that happened in the rough pass kind of survived. Like as far as the finished posing, for me, as long as the pose reads and is clear and articulate, I think there's no need to go, because again, there's a finished animation, so there's no real need to make the storyboard super pretty, unless that is the way that that particular board artist works. But yeah, I feel like this scene stayed pretty true to its form throughout most of its process. Yeah, I can show you. So this is the end kind of the presentation that I had. But before we wrap it up, I can show you just a couple of other things. So on some shows, the director's role doesn't end after boards. And on a lot of shows, it stays usually right up until you ship. So even after, say, the animatic is locked, they're like, okay, the animatic is done. Now we're going to send it to the animation studio to be animated. There's still certain things that might need explaining in advance. Final Space was a unique show in that the director did a lot of this stuff that sometimes falls under design, but I just thought it was interesting. So one of the things that we ended up doing was, at some point in this episode, there is this crazy robot monster made of tiny Kevins. So just to help the overseas artists, and this actually happened during cleanup. So this was given to the board artists before they tied down their boards, like really early on actually in their boards, so they could understand how these different Kevin robots were interlocked together. And this is not a final design. This is just a jumping off point. And then this was something that we did that did go over to the animation studio, which is an expression sheet. So not in this episode, but in another episode, there was this character who had extremely specific acting, like extremely specific acting. And so what I ended up doing was doing a pass of just like referencing the board's different expressions that she has, and kind of doing these little notes of like, this character's anger comes from a place of kind of heartbreak and loss. So all of her anger expressions should have like a slight twinge of loss. So for shows that do carry the director past the point of the animatic lock, what you usually end up doing at that point is talking with the overseas studio and preparing things for them, and then occasionally even giving notes after animation comes back. That's not always the case. Sometimes they bring in the big guns. They bring in a retake director whose entire job is just to give retake notes for, so if the animation studio, let's see if I can pull this up. Like, say for example, they send the first pass of this animation. Maybe you're like, I don't know about the arm position. And so the retake note would be like, please change his arm position to be more like over here instead of over here. And you usually would do little draw overs. So again, with the goal just being getting this to as close to the vision in the head of the director and in the head of the showrunner as you can, with the limitations of time and resources that TV animation has. Yeah, that's pretty much all that I have. I feel like I walked down memory lane because I haven't really looked at stuff from last year. And the thing you'll find as you work on different productions is that each show feels like it's a lifetime ago and yesterday at the same time. But thank you so much, Black Women Animate, for hosting this. And I really hope, let me stop scratching. I hope that this was helpful information. And again, if you want to download any of, I have like a bunch of these on storyboarding and art directing and production assistant and different aspects of the animation pipeline. That's all on www.toyarave.com. So feel free to check it out. But thank you so much for having me. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your boot camp. Right, bye.